Good evening, friends, and a very good morning to our other friends who might be watching from the Western Hemisphere, and a very good morning to you, Dr. Andrew Newberg.
Thank you. Good morning
Friends,
and
it
good
is my
evening.
great joy, blessing, and honor uh, to be introducing to us all today a professor whose books I have read for many years. I have gifted that book to many other doctor friends. I have conducted and shared much of the material from there in different workshops and sessions, in corporates, in spiritual circles, because the book is it's got a very interesting title, which is also the title for our talk, which we are all going to listen from Dr. Andrew Newberg this evening. And it's called How God Changes Your Brain, the Science of Neuroplasticity. And I'd like to say a few things over here in the beginning, that this is going to be a 1 hour session in which Dr. Andrew Newberg will share for about 45 to 50 minutes. And in the last part of his talk, he will be taking questions. So please send in your questions to us as you're watching this on YouTube in the comment section, and our team over here will be gathering those, and it'll be a wonderful opportunity to get answers from Dr. Andrew Newberg. I'd like to introduce him briefly. And Dr. Andrew Newberg is currently the research director at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Healthcare at Thomas Jefferson University and Hospital in Philadelphia. He is a professor in the Department of Integrative Medicine and Nutritional Sciences, with a secondary appointment in the Department of Radiology at Thomas Jefferson University. And he is adjunct professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. He is board certified in internal medicine and nuclear medicine. He has actively pursued a number of neuroimaging research projects, which have included the study of aging and dementia, epilepsy, and other neurological and psychiatric disorders. Dr. Newberg has been particularly involved in the study of mystical and religious experiences, a field referred to as neurotheology. He has published 10 books, which have been translated into 16 different languages. And he was listed as one of the 30 most influential neuroscientists alive today by the online psychology degree guide. So, on behalf of all of our viewers in the Eastern and the Western Hemisphere, this is a global program. Dr. Andrew Newberg, as you know, I welcome you once again, and I offer this platform to you. And we are eager to listen to your sharing.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and very excited to be here and to be able to share some exciting ideas with everyone. I'm going to actually go to share my screen, if that's okay with everyone. And if, let's see, okay. So, as you all heard, the title of my presentation today is How God Changes Your Brain, the Science of Neuroplasticity. And this in and of itself is an interesting intersection. A lot of my research, as we'll be talking about, has looked at the relationship between the brain and our religious and spiritual selves, how that all interacts with each other, what changes go on in the brain when people engage in practices like meditation, prayer, or even hold different kinds of religious and spiritual beliefs. And we'll be talking about all of this today. But an underlying theme of all of this, and consistent with the conference, is the idea of neuroplasticity, about how the brain changes as well. And even going back to some of the earliest work that myself and my late colleague Eugene DeQuilly had done, we talked a lot about the two most essential functions of the brain, one being self-maintenance and the other being self-transcendence. The idea is that the brain helps us to survive, that's the self-maintenance part, and also helps us to adapt and develop and to change from one stage of life to the next, and that's the self-transcendent part. But that self-transcendent part, as well as the survival part, is also all wrapped up in the idea of the brain being able to change. And that's really the idea of neuroplasticity, the idea that the brain can adapt and can continue to develop as we go through our lives. And in many ways, spirituality and religion offer a kind of ultimate expression of this self-transcendence, of these kinds of changes that we will continue to explore and we have studied using a lot of our imaging techniques, and we'll be going over those kinds of studies a little bit later. So to introduce the topic, many of you are familiar with this image. This is the painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo, the idea of God reaching out to Adam in the creation of human beings. And there was an article that came out in the Journal of the American Medical Association about 25 years ago or so that was done by a neuroscientist who had gone to visit the Sistine Chapel, looked up at the beautiful ceiling, and realized that he saw something in this that was a little bit different than what most people typically see. Now, perhaps it was because he was a neuroscientist, but what he saw when he looked at the image of God in the painting is an unusual a sort of connection with the human brain. The brain kind of fit into that space very, very well. And it started him thinking about the human brain and the creation of humanity, that part of what he kind of inferred from all of this is that perhaps it was not so much that human beings were created, the whole body of ourselves by God, but it was more the mind, the brain that makes us what we are, that makes us human, that was part of what was created by God in that context. And he goes into an interesting discussion about how the hand that's reaching out is actually coming out of the frontal lobes, which are actually very unique in human beings. The frontal lobes in human beings are larger relative to our brain size than any other animal. And so that in many ways is part of what makes us human, the ability to think and concentrate and to plan our days and all these what they're called executive functions that come out of the frontal lobes. So again, this is a fun little thought process, but an interesting idea nonetheless. And I think perhaps more importantly, the idea that we are able to start to think about how we might link what's going on in our brain with the religious and spiritual part of who we are. Now, another important word in my title is God, how God changes your brain. And on one hand, that's to evoke something in people, but perhaps it could have been how spirituality changes your brain. It could have been how religion changes your brain, how beliefs change your brain. But for the moment, let's just focus a little bit on God, at least as a concept, because there are some interesting things that we can say about what God is and how people around the world think about what that concept means. To me, one of the fascinating things about the term is that it is a very evocative term. It stirs up a lot of emotions around the world, both in the Western as well as Eastern traditions. It creates a lot of confusion. What exactly is God? How do we think about God? It's certainly very controversial. People who believe in God, people who don't believe in God. It causes a great deal of love, and unfortunately, sometimes it causes a great deal of hatred. And in many ways, the ideas that come about through our religious and spiritual pursuits inundate society at every level. In fact, I've often noted that, if you go back into ancient times, there really has never been a civilization that has been created without some kind of religious or spiritual ideas that are deeply embedded in the overall fabric of what that civilization is about. So what does this word really mean, and how does it have such a tremendous impact on human beings? And again, part of it is even just, how do we define it? How do we think about what God is? And do we define God as a being, as a thought, as consciousness, everything, nothing? Definitions of God certainly are very difficult to come by, at least one that everyone can agree upon. And from a scientific perspective, we can start to think about the different ways in which we access these kinds of concepts. You heard in my introduction that I am very involved in the field of neurotheology, the field that really studies the link between our brain and our religious and spiritual selves. Well, one of the first things that I talk about in neurotheology, and I wrote a book called The Principles of Neurotheology, the first chapter is about definitions. And how do we come to those definitions? How do we explore them? That's all wrapped up in the science of how we think about these questions. So there are many ways of approaching the concept of God. There are certainly the religious and theological. What do the sacred texts have to say, whether it's the Bible, the Vedas, the ancient scholars, theologians. But there are other ways, and especially as we work our way into the modern world, sociology, anthropology, art, aesthetics, and ultimately neuroscience have all had some ways of looking at what the concept of God, religion, spirituality have to do with regard to who we are as human beings. Now, this ultimately, to me, the fact that all of these ideas, and specifically the notion of God, has such a power within humanity, the question is, well, why? And so, as a neuroscientist, part of my answer to that question has always been these kinds of ideas, these concepts must have a tremendous impact when it comes to the human brain. And if our brain can kind of wrap itself around a concept such as God or religion or spirituality, how does it do that? Where in the brain are we actually thinking about God, religion, and spirituality? Now, one thought, and I don't know how many people out there are familiar with the cartoon The Simpsons, but this is Homer, and this was always one of my favorite slides. The idea that in his brain, he's got some very interesting areas that work on his life. But the question really is there some particular place in the brain where there is our religious and spiritual selves? When you walk into a church, when you walk into a monastery, when you start to pray, is there some one part of the brain that turns on and is our spiritual side of ourselves? Or is it more than that? And I hope to be able to show you as we go through the talk today that it probably is pretty complicated, and it really should come as no surprise that there may be lots of parts of our brain that become involved, because when we do engage our religious and spiritual side, when we think about God, we use a lot of different things. We use our thoughts, our memories, our emotions, our experiences. So, in fact, when you really get down to it, it seems like almost all the different parts of our brain become involved when we engage our spiritual side. And we might argue that if there is a God spot of our brain, it's really the whole of our brain. And as you also heard in my introduction, I'm in a newly found Department of Integrative Medicine, which is the first Department of Integrative Medicine in the United States at an academic medical center. And we understand that the brain and the body are intimately interconnected. So if there is a spiritual part of ourselves, it really may be all of us, because we feel when we pray, when we dance, when we sing, all of those things are all part of what's going on in the body itself, as well as what we are thinking up in the brain itself. So just to get all of us together on the same page, I do want to refer to a couple of specific areas. This is actually similarly aligned to that image that we saw a few moments ago with the Sistine Chapel. So this is a side view of the brain, and the very front of the brain, which is towards the left of the slide, we see the frontal lobe. And I've referred to this as an attention area. It helps us to concentrate. It helps us to focus our attention on whatever tasks we have before us. It helps to regulate our emotional responses. It helps us to move and generate language. So the frontal lobe does an awful lot for us. And certainly when we start to think about religious and spiritual activities, praying to God, meditating, and so forth, the frontal lobe is probably going to play an important role in that. Along the side of the brain is the temporal lobe, and this houses a number of important structures and ultimately functions. It includes parts of our visual areas. So if you have a visual image of God, and certainly many of the icons and images, whether it's a Buddha or Shiva, Jesus, all of these different images that we hold in our brain, in part are associated with our visual areas of the brain. The temporal lobe is also involved in our language areas. In fact, sort of towards the upper part of it, you see a little arrow going to the verbal conceptual area. And that's really at the junction between the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. And this is where we have a lot of abstract thought processes and memory processes, and certainly language processes as well. So when we read a sacred text, when we talk about God, these are the areas that are getting involved that help us to conceive of these ideas and how we think about them, how we incorporate them into our beliefs and so forth. Deeper in the temporal lobe is the limbic system, which is our main emotional centers, and I'm going to show a slide in a moment about that. But before I do that, I just want to come back to one last part of the brain before we keep moving on. which is the back top part of the brain that I have listed here as the orientation association area. So this takes a lot of sensory information and associates it together to create a sense of space and time for us so that we can orient our body, orient ourselves within space and time. And this helps us to navigate through the world in general, but also when we start to talk about how we connect to other people, how we connect to the universe, to God, we expect that there's going to be some interesting changes going on in the brain in this orientation part of the brain. Now, as I mentioned, a little deeper into the brain, particularly in the temporal lobes, are a lot of the limbic system structures, especially the amygdala and the hippocampus. These are involved in our emotional processes, so our feelings of love, joy, compassion, anger, fear, and so forth, both positive and negative emotions come about in large part by what's going on in these areas. And interestingly, these areas are also very involved in our memory processes. The hippocampus in particular writes a lot of what we remember into our brain. So again, going back to the concept of neuroplasticity, the emotional centers of our brain on one help us to feel the emotions, but actually are essential for neuroplasticity in the brain because they help us to remember things and they help us to change those memories. And it makes a lot of sense that the emotional centers of the brain would be involved in this because from a purely survival perspective, from that self-maintenance perspective, we need to remember things that are either really good or really bad. So if we ate some poisonous plant, or if we were near an area that we got beaten up in or something like that, or somebody stole our stuff, those negative emotions fire up our brain, tell us to remember not to go there or not to eat that or whatever, and that helps us to survive the next time. On the other hand, when something really good happens to us, we fall in love, we succeed at our job or at school, then those positive emotions come in and they help us to remember things. And of course, unfortunately, the negative emotions tend to evoke stronger changes in the brain, stronger memories. In part, that's because that's what the brain is designed to do. But it can sometimes lead to problems, especially when it comes to things like traumas and various emotional issues that anxieties that people face that can ultimately incapacitate them. While neuroplasticity is always going on and can change the brain over time, sometimes that can become more of a challenge. And we'll talk about some of these things a little bit later. So I've already talked a little bit about these different areas of the brain. What we're looking at, this is the first brain imaging study I want to bring up. This is a SPECT scan. So SPECT stands for single photon emission computed tomography. This is a commonly used approach to looking at what's going on in the brain and various states of the brain. We have used it quite a lot in our studies of neurotheology and looking at different practices like meditation and prayer. What it involves is injecting a small amount of a radioactive tracer that follows some part of the body or the brain's physiology, in this case, changes in blood flow. And the brain works very nicely in the sense that the more active a particular area of the brain is, the more blood flow it gets. It's sort of like the engine in your car. If you want to go faster, you deliver more gasoline to it and you go faster. So if you're concentrating more, if you need to turn on your frontal lobes to concentrate, to focus attention, then you get more blood flow there and the tracer goes there. The colors on the scan represent the amount of activity. So red is the most active, followed by the yellow, the blue, and the black. What we see here are two scans from the same individual, one during prayer, and this was actually from a study we did of Franciscan nuns doing a kind of Christian prayer called centering prayer, where they focus on a particular phrase or a particular prayer itself and contemplate it and keep coming back to it. And they do this for 45 minutes, an hour. Part of it is to understand the nature of the prayer, but more importantly, to create a kind of connection with God in a very powerful kind of way. So part of what we see is that the frontal lobe turns on. It becomes more red where the arrow is compared to the baseline scan when they were just at rest. And this makes a lot of sense to us because they are concentrating on the prayer or on the phrase itself that they are focusing this meditative practice on. This is also a verbal practice. They are focusing on a prayer, on a phrase. And so we see increased activity in that verbal conceptual area, that language area of the brain that's at the junction of the temporal and the parietal lobes. And so we see an increased blob of this red activity in that region as well. And I should also mention that all of this, while we're looking at colors here, All of this can be quantified, and so the research articles that we publish on this data don't really talk about this in a qualitative way, but actually have numbers, and we can talk about statistically significant differences, especially if we bring together a group of individuals who are all doing the same kind of practice. Now, another interesting topic that frequently comes up is, what's the difference between people who are and who are not religious? While this is an N of 1 study, an interesting little scan that we did was taking a friend of mine, who was a very expert meditator, had been meditating for many, many years, 20 years on a daily basis, and had done a number of different kinds of meditation practices over time, but really did not believe in religion per se. He did not believe in God. And so what we decided to do is we asked him that as his target of meditation, which oftentimes would be a candle or his breath or something like that, we asked him to meditate on the concept of God and to see where that took him with regard to his practice. And so when we look at his brain, when we look at his baseline scan and when we look at his meditation scan while contemplating God, what we see, if you look at the frontal lobes, is not much changing there. It doesn't really activate. If anything, maybe it drifts down just a little bit. But the way I interpreted this information is that here you have somebody who clearly knows how to meditate, but they were not really able to grab on to the concept of, or the target of the meditation. And so I think a real take-home message of this particular scan is that it is fundamentally important for people to be able to believe in and really fully engage whatever the practice is that they're doing. So for example, if you are engaged in a particular kind of program, a yoga program, if you're just going through those motions and those stretches, if you're just doing, if somebody says, we want you to meditate, and you just kind of sit there and don't do it, then you're not really getting out of it what you ultimately can be. The idea is to try to find the practices and the approaches that really have meaning for you. And by doing that, you can fully engage the brain. And we've actually shown this in some other studies, that when people are just kind of doing these prayers in a perfunctory kind of way, they're just repeating them, they really don't get the full impact of the brain as when you're truly doing something that you really believe in. And again, tying this back to the notion of neuroplasticity and changing the brain, if you're just kind of going through the motions, you don't really learn very much. You don't really change the brain very much. But when you can very consciously, very purposely work on trying to make the brain different through a practice like meditation or other kinds of neurocognitive processes, then you can affect the greatest change. And we see this in everything. I mean, it's like playing a musical instrument. If you just go and you just try to read the notes and play the violin or play the piano, you'll learn how to do it, but you don't get really good unless you engage it, unless you almost can become part of the instrument and fully be part of the entire process. So when we talk about the concept of God in particular, and again, this can be extrapolated to a lot of ideas about consciousness, about spirituality, and so forth. We tend to break down these different cognitive processes into a variety of options for us to think about. Holistic approaches, reductionistic approaches, ideas about causality, abstract ideas, logic, rationality, philosophy, theology, binary processes, picking up opposites, for example, and a few others that I'm not going to touch on every one of these, but there are lots of different cognitive domains in the brain here that we all can use in different ways to engage our religious and spiritual selves. And this is perhaps the most important thing about all of this, is that each one of us may take one or a few of these, not necessarily all of them, in how we do think about religion and spirituality. So for some people, it might be a very emotional process. For others, it might be this kind of holistic idea. For others, it might be some kind of experience. So depending on who you are and how you think about these different ideas, you can be using different parts of your brain and activating different parts of your brain. So just to dive into a few of these in more detail, the holistic function, if you will, is probably involving the parietal lobes. The idea here is that if the parietal lobes normally take our sensory information and help us to create our sense of self and our sense of space and time, then when somebody is engaged in a strong meditative practice or prayer practice where they lose their sense of self and where they feel at one with the universe, at one with God, that there would actually be a decrease of activity in this area. If normally it turns on to give us our sense of self and our sense of space and time, and then when we lose our sense of self and lose our sense of space and time, these areas of the brain go away, they shut down. And we have seen exactly this kind of change in the brain scans. Now, again, ultimately, there are other ways of thinking about this from a very theological perspective about how do people actually think about God as a unified whole, as individual parts that are brought together. There's a lot of interesting things that we get to discuss ultimately in terms of theology. But the point here is that our holistic function is what is being brought to bear on how we understand this particular idea. And returning to the study of the nuns is just one example. What we see is that in the parietal lobe, at rest, there's kind of an equal amount of activity in that area compared to the frontal lobes. But if you look at the prayer scan at the bottom part of the scan, which is the back of the brain here, you're looking at a decrease of activity in the parietal lobes. It's much more yellow than red. And this is exactly what we've seen not only in Christian prayer, but in Buddhism, Hindu, Sikh prayer, many different types of prayer practices and meditative practices where the person, as they begin to have that feeling of connectedness and oneness, the parietal lobes actually start to quiet down or shut down. Now, from a more philosophical or theological part, when we talk about God, frequently there is a lot of discussion about causality. Did God cause the world to occur? Does God continue to cause the world to occur? And a lot of this notion of causality probably arises in large part in the lower part of the parietal lobe, kind of close to where the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe come together. It's part of our abstract thought processes. There's a lot of interesting things that go on in these areas, but they basically enable us to determine cause and effect in the world. Again, a very important survival ability, so that if you eat the wrong food and you start vomiting, you connect that. You connect, oh, I shouldn't have eaten those berries, or I shouldn't have eaten that animal because that is what caused me to have a problem. I'm not going to do that again in the future. So that causal relationship is essential for helping us understand how the world works and to help us survive within that world. If we apply this sense of causality to the physical world, we get the scientific method. How does chemistry work? Physics, biology, what causes what to happen? If we apply this to the human world, we get social sciences and psychology. If we're a good person, do good things happen to us in our social environment? If we're a bad person, what happens to us? And again, if we talk about this from a religious or spiritual perspective, we get to concepts of God and some kind of ultimate reality, some ultimate causality, a cause of all things that is fundamental to virtually every religious and spiritual tradition. The binary function of the brain is also a very interesting way in which we look at the world. It is very survival adaptive. It helps us to look at the world in terms of opposites. And this is probably also kind of in that junction between the temporal and the parietal lobes. We often grow up learning language by talking about synonyms and antonyms, the words that sound the same and mean the same versus words that are different. And this is fundamental to various religious and spiritual ideas about morality, good versus evil, right versus wrong, and just good versus bad. And again, there's a survival advantage, but ultimately it helps us to try to categorize things in the world. And from a religious or spiritual perspective, one of the most basic opposites is human beings versus God. How do we, as very finite, mortal, individual beings, have any kind of connection to the universe, to a universal consciousness, to God, to something that is omniscient, all-powerful, all-knowing, however one defines this divine being? How do we have a relationship with that? And so the binary function helps us to think about that in various kinds of ways. This is an interesting topic that we have thought about a little bit more recently in our work, the idea of surrendering oneself and the notion of the opposite of that, which is being willful and purposeful versus being purposeless. And certainly the idea of free will is fundamental to a lot of traditions about, how we behave and what we can be held accountable for. But also, for many of you who have had perhaps a profound spiritual experience at one point in your life, there is this sense of surrender, the sense that we're not making it happen, but it is something that is happening to us. And of course, there are specific traditions like Islam, which literally means to surrender oneself to God. So there's a lot of traditions and a lot of experiences where a person feels that they no longer are making things happen, but they are things that are happening to them. And and one of the areas that we think is very involved in this is the frontal lobe. That, as I said, the frontal lobe turns on when we focus our attention on something, when we have willfulness and purposefulness. But our other studies have shown that the frontal lobe shuts down when people feel a sense of surrender and a lack of control. And I think this also plays back into the discussion about neuroplasticity, because normally our frontal lobes kind of hold all of our ideas, all of our beliefs about the world in place. I sometimes come up with the analogy of thinking about our brain as a big file folder, and our frontal lobes keep all the files in place, and that we know where all those files are. So when we go to work, we take out our work folder and then we put it back. When you have this kind of intense experience, it's as if the frontal lobe shut down. All of the controls on those file cabinets go away. All the folders get thrown up into the air. And then when your frontal lobes finally come back online, you start putting them all back furiously into the file cabinets. But what also is happening here is that your brain is rearranging. So here we're bumping into that concept of neuroplasticity again, the idea that now suddenly we have enabled all the controls to go off of our brain, and we have allowed new ideas, new beliefs, new behaviors, and so forth to become part of how we actually think about the world. And so again, part of what happens with neuroplasticity is not just the ability to create new connections, but to also suspend old ones. Because if we never allow the old ones to go away, then we're never able to create the new ones and the new ideas and the beliefs that come along with it. We've talked earlier about the limbic system and our emotions that are tied into religion and spirituality. Certainly, there are many different emotional processes, both positive and negative, feelings of love, joy, awe, forgiveness, but also at times feelings of dread, fear, hate. And we see this a lot in religious traditions, especially when they confront alternative traditions, a lot of anger and hatred sometimes in the world when people believe things that are different from whatever our own personal beliefs are. So it is important to use these emotions. It helps to identify the important ideas. It helps to, as we talked about earlier, because the emotional centers of our brain, like our hippocampus, help to write ideas into our memory banks. This is all part of neuroplasticity in the brain and changing the way we think over time. And that's why a practice like meditation or prayer, if you start doing it when you're a child and then an adolescent and an adulthood, you are constantly changing and adapting your brain to those kinds of ideas and those kinds of processes that allow your brain to continue to develop as you go forward through your life. This was an interesting little study we did of actually Jewish meditation. We published a book called The Rabbi's Brain, where we looked at a rabbi who was singing a very prominent prayer called the Shema, which basically identifies God as one, a very important concept in Judaism. And you can see where the arrows are pointing. This was an MRI study that we did, which also looks at blood flow. You can see two of the most prominent little blobs of increased activity are in the amygdala, in that emotional center of the brain. So for the rabbi doing this prayer, we see a very intense emotional reaction, which is different from people who don't have this connection to this particular prayer. So we see this in a lot of different prayer practices where there are intense experiences of joy and happiness as part of a spiritual practice. So, I just mentioned a moment ago the idea of practices again, meditation, prayer, yoga, and so forth. These are spiritual practices that actually change your brain. And of course, this is where we see, excuse me, the intersection between spirituality or religion and neuroplasticity, because we can use brain imaging and other kinds of scientific measures to evaluate what's going on during the practice and look longitudinally at how people who are doing a practice over time literally changed their brain. And we can see that this neuroplasticity, not really so much at the neuronal level, although theoretically one could begin to look at that as well, but certainly on the larger scale level of how our brain operates, how different parts of our brain turn on, turn off, grow, shrink, and so forth. And these kinds of longitudinal studies become very important for us to understand how the brain changes over time, and in particular, how various spiritual practices change the brain over time. As an example, one of the very first studies that we did that really looked into this neuroplasticity aspect was a study of a practice called Kirtan Kriya meditation, which derives out of the Kundalini yoga tradition. Some of you may be familiar with this. It is a singing meditation where you have to repeat a certain set of sounds, sa, ta, na, and ma. You move your fingers in conjunction with those sounds. So sa, you touch your finger, your index finger to your thumb, ta, your middle finger to your thumb, na, the ring finger to your thumb, and ma, your pinky finger, your fifth finger to your thumb. And you do that in succession. You do it out loud, you do it in a whisper, you do it in silence. And what we did was we took a bunch of people who had never meditated before, and in particular, a group of older individuals. We scanned their brain initially, and then after 8 weeks of daily practice with the Kirtan Kriya meditation, and we also tested their memory as well. So this is really one of the first studies that I'm aware of that looked at the longitudinal effect of a practice in time. And so what we did was, these are SPECT scans again. The A scan is the very first resting scan that we did with the individual. So this is just the person basically walking in off the street and scanning their brain at rest. Then we taught them how to do the meditation practice and scan their brain while they did it the first time. That was the B scan. The C scan is their resting scan again when they come in after 8 weeks of doing the practice on a daily basis. And I should note also that for this particular study, they did it for 12 minutes a day. So it was a relatively brief practice. And the D scan is the final scan while they were doing their last meditation. So the most important two scans here are really the A and the C scan, because these are the scans of the brain at rest. And before I talk about where the arrow is pointing, I want us to look at the top of each of the scans, which is where the frontal lobes are. And what you can see is that there is more red activity across the top part of the brain in the C scan compared to where there is in the A scan. This means that there is more activity in the frontal lobes after they had done this practice for 8 weeks. And we really expected this because it is a concentration technique, and arguably it is kind of an exercise for your brain. The more you focus on these sounds, the more you do the practice, the more you are turning those frontal lobes on. And interestingly, this is consistent with some other studies that have looked at long-term meditators compared to non-meditators, and have found that their frontal lobes are literally thicker than those people who are non-meditators. So this really gets into the whole neuroplasticity piece very clearly, that these practices change your brain over time. And if you can create a change in doing a practice for 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks, you can imagine what's going on in the brain of a nun, of a monk, of some type of meditator over many years, hours a day, how that will continue to change and adapt their brain over time. The last structure I want to point out here, but also very, very important in our overall understanding of religion and spirituality, is a very central structure called the thalamus. And you can see that in the A scan, the thalamus is a bit asymmetric. The one side where the arrow is a little bit more red than on the other side. But when the person comes back, there is almost an equalization of the two parts of the brain. And if you look at the D scan, the other side actually becomes even more active. So the thalamus, which we haven't talked about yet, is a very central structure that helps to connect different parts of the brain to each other, and also helps to take a lot of sensory information up from the body and from our sensory organs like the eyes and ears into the brain. So in many ways, the thalamus is the seat of our consciousness, perhaps. Certainly it is the seat of a lot of our thought processes, and is essential for us creating our sense of reality. So once again, I would submit that if we can change this part of the function of this part of the brain through neuroplasticity by doing a practice for 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks, you can imagine how these traditions, these spiritual practices and traditions change people's brains over many, many years, and how that has a tremendous impact on the brain itself and, of course, the person's beliefs and behaviors. Now, I want to digress for a little bit just to say that obviously, while we can look at what's going on in the brain, we don't really know what that means until we actually talk to the person and find out what they are actually feeling and thinking. And this is a whole other aspect of neurotheology, which is to not just bring in the neuroscience, which is obviously an important point, but to also get at the qualitative, subjective experiences that people have when it comes to their religious and spiritual ideas, their beliefs, their experiences. So we can ask some interesting questions like, what does God look like to you? What does God feel like to you? How do you think about God? Does God have certain attributes and so forth? And how do you understand them? So we started to do these kinds of questions. And for example, we did a very simple study where every time we went around and gave a talk, we would hand out a paper and pencil, and we would ask people to very quickly draw whatever pops into your mind first when I say, draw what God looks like to you. And to some extent, I would suggest that every one of you try that at some point. What would you draw? What comes into your mind? An image, a face, an idea. So we had about 400 of these pictures, and I will share a few of them with you. This was from one of our youngest drawers, so to speak. This was from an 11-year-old. And this is not that far off from the Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. It is an image of a man with a beard, kind of floating. Those are clouds behind him, telling us what to do. And a lot of people draw these more anthropomorphic ideas about God, thinking about God as a being, as a person, which helps them to relate to God in some way. Other people draw more abstract concepts, and this was always one of my favorite ones. It includes circles, a heart, it includes the peace sign, the symbols for male and female, and also the sun. So here you're trying to get at God in a very kind of abstract type of way. And when we actually analyzed these 400 or so images, we came up with the idea that about 2/3 of them drew either an abstract or nature scene. In fact, that was divided in half roughly. So about 1/3 of the people draw something abstract like the hearts and so forth and shapes and swirls. About 1/3 of people draw nature scenes, rivers flowing, mountains, galaxies, stars, that kind of thing. Only about 20% of people drew something that was anthropomorphic, some kind of humanized face of some kind. And interestingly, about 15% of the people left it blank. Now, again, we wanted to know what that meant. And so when we asked we asked everybody to describe their drawing. And it was interesting because of the people who left it blank, some people were deeply religious, while others were deeply non-religious. And it was interesting that the answers that they gave us. For the people who were deeply religious, they said God is completely unknowable and therefore undrawable. On the other hand, atheists would say there is no God, so there is nothing to draw. So here, to me, there's a larger take-home point here, which is that even when we're talking about something, if we're having an argument with somebody about God or morality or politics or whatever, so much of it has to do with our definitions and how we think about these concepts. And that has a lot to do with how our brain is applied to those concepts. But we need to also think about that in the context of when we actually engage discussions with other people, what is it that we're really talking about and how do we use that information usefully? A study out of Baylor actually asked people about what God felt like. And they came up with the idea that there were kind of 4 different types of God. One of them was an authoritarian God, the notion that God was kind of right here all the time. And keep in mind, this was in the United States, so this is certainly more of a Judeo-Christian perspective of God. But that God was here and controlling things and making sure that everything was happening on Earth. The other, actually, and I apologize for the little split here, but I'm going to jump down to distant God, because that's really the contrast to the authoritarian God. Distant God is the God that wound up the universe at the beginning and then left and just kind of left everything to its devices. Interestingly, this also operates along a binary concept, as we talked about earlier, and a spatial concept, because God is either here or God is out there. The other 2 types of God are more emotionally related, the critical versus the benevolent God. God is critical. God is not happy with us. We've been bad. We've sinned. And so we have God has a very negative view about humanity. or God is here to help us, and God is here to get us through and help us to deal with all the things that we deal with in life. And again, these are the binary processes operating on the emotional system, positive versus negative. I would argue that there may even be a fifth type of God, which is more of a mystical type, which I think fits more in line with Buddhist and Hindu teachings, and the idea that God is a little bit of all of these things, and in some sense, a oneness of all of these things. And so that is not as much of a tradition in the United States, so they didn't really pick that up in the context of their study. But this is a great starting point, and we need to do a lot more to understand what each of these different ideas means to people. When it comes to neuroplasticity, it is also essential for us to look at both the good and the bad when it comes to religion and spirituality. Negative ideas about God can be very detrimental, both on an individual as well as a societal level. For individuals, negative views of God can lead to stress, anxiety, and depression. If you think that God is punishing you because you are a bad person, then it can lead to very negative feelings about yourself. If you feel like you got cancer because you weren't spiritual enough, then maybe you're not going to try to fight it, or you're not going to comply with the appropriate medical treatments. And ultimately, these kinds of negative beliefs activate the negative emotional structures of the brain and activate negative emotional processes in the brain that change the brain as well, and change the brain into negative beliefs that ultimately can lead to both inwardly as well as outwardly destructive behaviors. So part of the hope is that through understanding these practices and understanding neuroplasticity, we can find the most effective ways of trying to redirect people and bring people into new ways of thinking that are more constructive and more positive, both for them as well as for society as a whole. Now, the last little topic I want to bring into, because I think it is relevant in this context, is the notion of brain health. Because when we talk about neuroplasticity, when we talk about spirituality, a lot of that in a very practical way comes into the topic of brain health and what it means to be a healthy person, and in particular, how to keep your brain healthy. So good brain health really emphasizes brain growth and neuroplasticity, the idea that we can always change where we are and what we are. And studies of neuroplasticity have clearly shown that the brain can continue to grow and develop into our 90s and beyond. So a 90-year-old can learn how to play a new instrument, can read a new book, can learn a new idea. And so the brain always has the ability to continue to change and to adapt. And that is a remarkable ability that the brain actually has. Now, obviously, for very entrenched ideas and beliefs, sometimes that's hard. And sometimes it doesn't mean that neuroplasticity is easy. It does take energy, it takes purposefulness, it takes a lot of work at times, but it is something that can definitely happen. And ultimately, this has an impact on your cognition, all the different processes and many others that we're talking about, our memory, our attention, the way we process information, language, and so forth. It can change our mood. We can, by doing practices that evoke feelings of gratitude and love and loving kindness for other people, we can change how we feel. We can change our empathy, and we can change the emotional processes themselves so that we become a more positive person. This provides us with greater senses of insight and self-awareness. It can make us more alert and keep our concentration and attention more active. It can help us to function independently and continue to explore and grow and develop on ourselves. This is a little bit more important even for the elderly who may need to manage their finances or take care of themselves. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the notions of religion and spirituality that lead to the idea of self-transcendence and providing that next step for where we go as human beings, being true to oneself, a sense of integrity and self-compassion, as well as being loving to others, and whether that's other human beings, whether that's animals, whether it's the universe as a whole, God, that we have the ability to do all of these things. And I think this in many ways focuses us on how we take care of ourselves. In the integrative medicine department that I work in, we use a four-dimensional model of the human person, that we have a biological side, a psychological side, a social side, and the religious and spiritual side. And so we ideally, for good brain health, want to engage all of these different parts of ourselves. This is what helps us to optimize our brain function, to optimize the brain's ability to change and adapt, and to keep us as healthy as possible. So good exercise, nutrition, social involvement, cognitive engagement, learning, reading, developing, making sure that you sleep well, different neuromodulatory approaches, including practices like meditation, mindfulness, prayer, yoga, whatever, again, I mentioned that before, whatever practices you feel you can really connect with, those are the ones that are most likely to help. When you follow all of this together in a consistent manner, that basically all of them work together to become more than just the sum of any of these individual dimensions, and they can sustain a healthy and thriving brain and thriving cognitive function for all of your days. And in fact, this was borne out by a research study called the NeuroGrow Brain Fitness Project, which was a multi-center trial that was led by Johns Hopkins. It was a 12-week program for patients who had mild cognitive impairment, and it incorporated cognitive skills training, meditation, helping people with depression, including medical treatment at times when needed, other types of neuromodulatory processes like neurofeedback, various aspects of counseling for stress reduction, improving their diet, and ultimately they had not only improvements in their cognitive function, but their MRIs showed a reduction in atrophy, that their brain actually was growing, and so they were doing better. And I should mention that concomitantly in that Kirtan Kriya study, even though we showed improvements in the brain function, we also showed improvements in memory processes as well. So in the end, where does all of this take us? We have a long way to, we've found some great stuff, but we have a long way to go. We hopefully will have continuing efforts to understand our world and requiring both our psychological, biological, social, and spiritual sides. And of course, focusing on the topic of the talk, the notion that religion and God changes our brain in many ways. The ideas of religion and spirituality and God affect our thoughts, perceptions, feelings, and behaviors. We can perceive God in a positive or negative way, and ultimately understanding this religious and spiritual side of ourselves helps us to improve ourselves both individually and globally. So this is the book, How God Changes Your Brain. I actually mentioned one of my more recent books earlier about the rabbi's brain. And if anybody is interested in looking into the other books and certainly the research articles that I've published, they're welcome to go to my website, which is just Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com. So I will leave it there. Thank you so much for your attention. And I think we still have about 5 or 6 minutes for some questions afterwards.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew Newberg. This was extremely enlightening, the length and breadth of what you shared. We do have quite a few questions, and friends, let me share at the outset that tomorrow we are also having another session on the US time with which is tonight, with Dr. Andrew Newberg, our time in India tonight in a few hours. So if you're interested, please stay tuned, and we will be taking some of these questions into that interview. But I hand it over to Dr. Amar to cover a few questions.
I think this question, Dr. Andrew, is a little cheeky one, because somebody is asking that I understand that everyone has a God spot, but what happens to his God spot when he commits any crime or, let's say, does any negative action?
Well, it's a really great question. We always are dealing with these kind of binary processes within ourselves. We have, the positive emotions, we have negative emotions, and where people are in their overall mindset and their balance. Unfortunately, some people, especially when they have been dealt with various traumas in their life, both physical as well as emotional, it changes their beliefs, it changes their behaviors. They may, not view other people in the same way as a person who is an otherwise healthy and positive person. Hopefully a healthy and positive person views other people compassionately. We want to help other people. And that makes us feel good when we help other people. But for people who have really struggled in life and who have brain processes that lead them to very negative ways of thinking, unfortunately, sometimes there's a lot of signals that get mixed up, and they are not able to utilize that that conscience, the moral ways of thinking about the world, and whether that's born out of traumas, desperation. Obviously, each person is different and unique, but yes, it is unfortunate. But the flip side of that question, and also going in line with the neuroplasticity, is that there is a very rich tradition and literature about incarcerated individuals finding religion and spirituality as a way of kind of changing who they are as a person. And obviously, it doesn't absolve them necessarily of doing whatever crime they may have committed, but for many people, they have come to religion as a way of working past all that anger and fear and negativity. And so again, it can lead in the right direction, even though at times, especially in those moments, it is overwhelmed by a lot of negativity and a lot of negative emotions. And that's also part of what I would hope neurotheology can help us with, especially, when you talk about those individuals who commit, various crimes and atrocities in the name of religion, is, where and how does that happen? And we really don't understand that fully. We need to look at that more, and hopefully that information will help us to guide people in directions that will make it much more positive.
I think that opens up another the question that, let us say, such people, as you explained, that those who have gone through some kind of trauma, and even if the God spot is dormant in them, let's say it becomes latent for a while, but there are maybe strategies which can be used to activate at maybe the right conditions. If we create the right environment around them, and the right kind of stimulus is given to them, that can probably activate their God spot in them. So maybe the science will see that whether this is truly happening or not. Because in the spiritual circles, we always say that there is something called satsang, which can help the consciousness to uplift in a person. Any thoughts on that subject, sir?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree that, and the thing that I'll also add is that, there really isn't a God spot. And so there are, what constitutes our religious and spiritual self is the sum total of all of our brain processes, our cognitions, and our emotions. So it is easy for those to be advanced and brought to the fore and utilized in the positive ways that you just mentioned. And unfortunately, sometimes when people do have a lot of negativity, then all of that gets suppressed, and there's a lot of aggression and hatefulness, and it can come out in very, very bad ways. And so, part of what spirituality hopefully teaches us is, can we get to that next level, that better level, and can each person strive towards their own individual enlightenment? I do, based on our research, and one whole line of work that we haven't talked about yet is a survey that we did of people's spiritual experiences. And we got a couple thousand people talking about their kind of mystical / spiritual experiences. And to me, the take home message of that was that it can happen to everyone, and it can happen to anyone. And so, while there are certainly people who do a lot of bad things out there, all of them, I think, within their brains have the ability to do something that is positive, and hopefully we can help people figure out the best way to engage that part of themselves.
Yeah, so quickly, I will take one last question, sir, here, that how generalizable are these brain scan studies, which are done on few people during the study?
So, that is an important aspect of neurotheology as an emerging field, that, some of the early work that we did was on a very small sample size, sometimes, a handful of people, 5, 10 people or so. But we and many other people are doing more and more studies. So as more studies on meditation are coming out, we're doing studies now on 80, 100 people. And also now, when we did our first publication of those brain scan studies, it was one of only 1 or 2 papers out there. Now there are over 100 brain imaging studies that have looked at different kinds of meditation practices. There are other there's a larger sample of clinical trials that have looked at practices like mindfulness and Kirtan Kriya and so forth. So hundreds and hundreds of people, different some in patient populations, teachers, nurses, doctors, regular, people dealing with different illnesses, chronic pain, So it is getting more and more generalizable as time goes on. And fundamentally, we would expect it to be generalizable because all of our brains are basically built the same way. We all have our frontal lobes and temporal lobes and limbic system. So we would think that these practices, especially practices that have been known about for 2,000 or more years, we kind of know that yoga works. And on one hand, it's nice to have a brain scan to show that to us, but you have 2,000 or 4,000 or whatever years of knowledge about how these systems work, and they've obviously worked on millions of people over the years. So it's great to have this scientific piece to kind of fill that gap, but it doesn't take away from the value and the importance of what these traditions have brought to us over the millennia. And hopefully this combination in neurotheology will help us, even further to be able to figure out what are the practices that work best, and how everyone can find the right practices for them to lead to their own personal growth and hopefully enlightenment.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Thank you. And friends, we will see Dr. Andrew Newberg again on the US track just in a couple hours. So you must have received an email, and please log on to that platform for that interview session. I'd like to close this session once again by thanking Dr. Andrew Newberg and taking a moment to show some of his books once again, which, as Sir mentioned, are available for purchase through his website and also through Amazon. Thank you, Doctor. May you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you again
Thank you, and
very soon.
see you soon.
And in the coming weeks and months in some follow-up sessions too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sounds good. See you soon.
See you soon.
See you soon.